Uncle Arhat and the two mules had been taken away by the Japs, and Grandma had washed her bloody face in the wine vat until it reeked of alcohol and was beet red. Her eyes were puffy. The front of her pale blue cotton jacket was soaked in wine and blood. She stood stock still beside the vat, staring down at her reflection. Father recalled how she had fallen to her knees and kowtowed 3 times to the vat, then stood up, scooped some wine with both hands, and drank it. The rosiness of her face was concentrated in her cheeks. All the color had drained from her forehead and chin. "Kneel down," she ordered Father. "Kowtow." He fell to his knees and kowtowed. "Take a drink." He scooped up a handful of wine and drank it. Trickles of blood, like threads, sank to the bottom of the vat, on the surface of which a tiny white cloud floated alongside the somber faces of Grandma and Father. Piercing rays emanated from Grandma's eyes. Father looked away, his heart pounding wildly. He reached out to scoop up some more wine, and as it dripped through his fingers, it shattered one large face and one small one amid the blue sky and white cloud. He drank a mouthful, which left the sticky taste of blood on his tongue. The blood sank to the base of the vat, where it congealed into a turbid clot the size of a fist. Father and Grandma stared at it long and hard. Then she pulled the lid over and rolled the millstone back, straining to place it on top of the lid. "Don't touch it," she said. Looking at the accumulation of mud and gray-green soap bugs squirming in the indentation of the millstone, he nodded, clearly disturbed by the sight. That night he lay on his kang, listening to Grandma pace the yard. The patter of her footsteps and the rustling sorghum in the fields formed Father's confused dreams, in which he heard the brays of our 2 handsome black mules. Father awoke once, at dawn, and ran naked into the yard to pee. There he saw Grandma staring transfixed into the sky. He called out, "Mom," but his shout fell on deaf ears. When he'd finished peeing, he took her by the hand and led her inside. She followed meekly. They'd barely stepped inside when they heard waves of commotion from the southwest, followed by the crack of rifle fire, like the pop of a tautly stretched piece of silk pierced by a sharp knife. Shortly after he and Grandma heard the gunfire, they were herded over to the dike, along with a number of villagers, elderly, young, sick, and disabled, by Japanese soldiers. The polished white flagstones, boulders, and coarse yellow gravel on the dike looked like a line of grave mounds. Last year's early summer sorghum stood spellbound beyond the dike, somber and melancholy. The outline of the highway shining through the trampled sorghum stretched due north. The stone bridge hadn't been erected then, and the little wood span stood utterly exhausted and horribly scared by the passage of tens of thousands of tramping feet and the iron shoes of horses and mules. The smell of green shoots released by the crushed and broken sorghum, steeped into the night mist, rose pungent in the morning air. Sorghum everywhere was crying bitterly. Father, Grandma, and the other villagers assembled on the western edge of the highway, south of the river, atop the shattered remnants of sorghum plants, faced a mammoth enclosure that looked like an animal pen. A crowd of shabby laborers huddled beyond it. 2 puppet soldiers herded the laborers over near Father and the others to form a second cluster. The 2 groups faced a square where animals were tethered, a spot that would later make people pale with fright. They stood impassively for some time before a thin-faced, white-gloved Japanese officer with red insignia on his shoulders and a long sword at his hip emerged from the tent, leading a guard dog, whose red tongue lolled from the side of its mouth. Behind the dog, 2 puppet soldiers carried the rigid corpse of a Japanese soldier. 2 Japanese soldiers brought up the rear, escorting 2 puppet soldiers who were dragging a beaten and bloody Uncle Arhat. Father huddled close to Grandma. She wrapped her arms around him. 50 or so white birds, wings flapping noisily, sliced through the blue sky above the Blackwater River, then turned and headed east towards the golden sun. Father could see the draught animals with scraggly hair and filthy faces, and our 2 black mules which lay on the ground. One was dead, the other hose still stuck in its head. The blood-soaked tail of the other mule swept the ground. The skin over its belly twitched noisily. Its nostrils whistled as they opened and closed. How Father loved those 2 black mules. He remembers Grandma sitting proudly on the mule's back, Father in her lap, the 3 of them flying down the narrow dirt path through the sorghum field, the mule rocking back and forth as it gallops along, giving Father and Grandma the ride of their lives. Spindly legs conquer the dust of the road as Father shouts excitedly. An occasional peasant, amid the sorghum, hoe in hand, gazes at the powdery, fair face of the distillery owner, his heart filled with envy and loathing. Now one of the mules was lying dead on the ground, its mouth open, a row of long white teeth chewing the earth. The other sat suffering more than its dead comrade. "Mom," Father said to Grandma, "our mules." She covered his mouth with her hand. The body of the Japanese soldier was placed before the officer, who continued to hold the dog's leash. The 2 puppet soldiers dragged the battered Uncle Arhat over to a wooden rack. Father didn't recognize him right away. He seemed just a strange bloody creature in human form. As he was dragged up to the rack, his head turned to the left, then to the right, the crusty scab on his scalp looking like the shiny mud on the riverbank, baked by the sun until it wrinkles and begins to crack. His useless feet traced patterns in the dirt. The crowd slowly recoiled. Father felt Grandma's hands grip his shoulders tightly. The people seemed to shrink in size, their faces clay-colored or black. Crows and sparrows suddenly silenced. The people could hear the panting of the guard dog. The officer holding its leash farted loudly. Before the puppet soldiers dragged the strange creature over to the rack, they dropped it to the ground, an inert slab of meat. "Uncle Arhat!" Father cried out in alarm. Grandma covered his mouth again. Uncle Arhat began to writhe, arching his buttocks as he rose his knees, propped himself on his hands, and raised his arms. His face was so puffy the skin shone. His eyes were slits through which thin greenish rays emerged. Father was sure Uncle Arhat could see him. His heart was pounding against the wall of his chest. Thump, thump, thump. And he didn't know if it was from fear or anger. He wanted to scream, but Grandma's hand was clasped too tightly over his mouth. The officer holding the leash shouted something to the crowd, and a crew-cut Chinese interrupted it for them. Father didn't hear everything the interpreter said. Grandma's hand was clasped so tightly over his mouth that he was having trouble breathing and his ears were ringing. 2 Chinese in black uniforms stripped Uncle Arhat naked and tied him to the rack. The Jap officer waved his arm, and 2 more black-clad men dragged and pushed Sun 5, the most accomplished hog butcher in our village, or anywhere in northeast Gaomi Township for that matter, out of the enclosure. He was a short, bold man with a huge paunch, a red nose, held a butcher's knife in his left hand and a pail of water in his right as he shuffled up to Uncle Arhat. The interpreter spoke. The commander says to skin him. If you don't do a good job of it, he'll have his dog tear your heart out. Son 5 mumbled an acknowledgement, his eyes blinking furiously. Holding the knife in his mouth, he picked up the pail and poured water over Uncle Arhat's scalp. Uncle Arhat's head jerked upwards when the cold water hit him. Bloody water coursed down his face and neck, forming filthy puddles at his feet. One of the overseers brought another pail of water from the river. Son 5 soaked a rag in it and wiped Uncle Arhat's face clean. When he was finished, his buttocks twitched briefly. Elder brother, Uncle Arhat said, finish me off quickly. I won't forget your kindness down in the Yellow Springs. The Japanese officer roared something. Get on with it, the interpreter said. Son 5's face darkened as he reached up and held Uncle Arhat's ear between his fingers. Elder brother, he said, there's nothing I can do. Father saw Son 5's knife cut the skin above the ear with sawing motion. Uncle Arhat screeched in agony as sprays of yellow piss shot out from between his legs. Father's knees were knocking. A Japanese soldier walked up to Son 5 with a white ceramic platter, into which Son put Uncle Arhat's large, fleshy ear. He cut off the other ear and laid it on the platter alongside the first one. Father watched the ears twitch, making thumping sounds. The soldier paraded slowly in front of the laborers and villagers, holding the platter out for them to see. Father looked at the ears, pale and beautiful. The soldier then carried the ears up to the Japanese officer, who nodded to him. He laid the platter alongside the body of his dead comrade. After a moment of silence, he picked it up and put it on the ground under the dog's nose. The dog's tongue slithered back into its mouth as it sniffed the ears with its pointy, wet, black nose. But it shook its head, with its tongue lolling again, and sat down. Hey, the interpreter yelled at Son 5. Keep going. Son 5 was walking round in circles, mumbling to himself. Father looked at his sweaty, greasy face and watched his eyelids blink like a bobbing head of a chicken. A mere trickle of blood oozed from the holes where Uncle Arhat's ears had been. Without them, his head had become a neat, unmarred oval. The Jap officer roared again. Hurry up, get on with it, the interpreter ordered. Son 5 bent over and sliced off Uncle Arhat's genitals with a single stroke, then put them into the platter held by the Japanese soldier, who carried it at eye level as he paraded like a marionette in front of the crowd. Father felt Grandma's icy fingers dig into his shoulders. The Japanese soldier put the platter under the dog's nose. It nibbled, then spat the stuff out. Uncle Arhat was screaming in agony, his bony frame twitching violently on the rack. Son 5 threw down the butcher knife, fell to his knees, and wailed bitterly. The Japanese officer let go of the leash, and the guard dog bounded forward, burying its claws in Son 5's shoulders and burying its fangs in his face. He threw himself on the ground and covered his face with his hands. The Japanese soldier whistled, and the guard dog bounded back to him, dragging the leash behind it. Skin him, and be quick about it, the interpreter demanded. Son 5 struggled to his feet, picked up his butcher knife, and staggered up to Uncle Arhat. Everyone's head jerked upward as a torrent of abuse erupted from Uncle Arhat's mouth. Son 5 spoke to him. Elder brother, try to bear it a little longer. Uncle Arhat spat a gob of bloody film into Son's face. Start skinning, shouted the interpreter. Fuck your ancestors. Skin him, I said. Son 5 started at the point on Uncle Arhat's scalp, where the scab had formed, zipping the knife blade down once, twice, and meticulous cut after another. Uncle Arhat's scalp fell away, revealing 2 greenish-purple eyes and several misshapen chunks of flesh. Father told me once that, even after Uncle Arhad's face had been peeled away, shouts and gurgles continued to emerge from his shapeless mouth, while endless rivulets of bright red blood dripped down from his pasty scalp. Son 5 no longer seemed human, as his flawless knife work produced a perfect pelt. After Uncle Arhad had been turned into a mass of meaty pulp, his innards churned and roiled, attracting swarms of dancing green flies. The women were on their knees, wailing piteously. That night a heavy rain fell, washing the tethering square clean of every drop of blood, and of Uncle Arhad's corpse and the skin that had covered it. Word that his corpse had disappeared spread through the village, from 1 person to 10 to 100, from this generation to the next, until it became a beautiful legend. If he thinks he can get away with playing games with me, I'll rip his head off and use it for a piss pot. The sun seemed to shrink as it rose in the sky, sending down white-hot rays. A flock of wild ducks flew through the rapidly dissipating mist atop the sorghum field, then another flock. Detachment leader Lang's troops still hadn't shown up, and only an occasional wild hare disturbed the peace of the highway. A while later, a wily red fox darted across the highway. "Hey!" Commander Yu shouted after cursing detachment leader Lang. "Everybody up! It looks like we've been tricked by that son of a bitch, Pocky Lang." That was just what the troops, tired of lying here, had been waiting to hear. They were on their way up before the sound of Commander Yu's command had died out. Some sat on the dike to enjoy smoke. Others stood to take a long-postponed piss. Father jumped up onto the dike, the head of the skinned Uncle Arhad floating in front of his eyes. Wild ducks, startled into flight by the sudden emergence of men on the dike, began landing in small clusters on a nearby sandbar, where they waddled back and forth, their emerald yellow feathers glistening among the water weeds. Mute walked up to Commander Yu, knife in one hand, his old Hangyang rifle in the other. Looking dejected, with lifeless eyes, he pointed to the sun in the southeastern sky and to the deserted highway. Finally, he pointed to his belly, grunted, and signaled in the direction of the village. Commander Yu thought for a moment, then called to the men on the western edge of the highway. "Come over here, all of you." The troops crossed the highway and formed up on the dike. "Brothers," Commander Yu said, "if Pocky Lang's playing games with us, I'll lop his damned head off. The sun isn't directly overhead yet, so we'll have to wait a little longer. If the convoy hasn't come by noon, we'll go to Tan Family Hollow and settle accounts with Lang. For now, go into the sorghum field and get some rest. I'll send Doguan for food." "Doguan!" Father looked up at Commander Yu. "Go tell your mom to have the woman make some fist cakes, and tell her I want lunch here by noon. Say I want her to bring it herself." Father nodded, hitched up his trousers, stuck the Browning pistol into his belt, and ran down the dike. After heading north down the highway for a short distance, he cut across the sorghum field, heading northwest, weaving in and out among the plants. In the sea of sorghum, he bumped into some long mule bones. He kicked one, dislodging a couple of short-tailed, furry field voles that had been feasting on marrow. They looked up fearlessly, then burrowed back into the bone. The sight reminded Father of the family's 2 black mules, reminded him of how, long after the highway had been complete, the pungent smell of death hung over the village every time a southeastern wind rose. A year later, the bloated carcasses of dozens of mules had been found floating in the Blackwater River, caught in the reeds and grass in the shallow water by the banks. Their distended bellies, baked by the sun, split and popped, released their splendid innards, like gorgeous blooming flowers, as slowly spreading pools of dark green liquid were caught up in the flow of water.